So the precise techniques, so this just has to do with vocab. Precise techniques are for when you know the definition of a word and you know it well. By the way, when you guys make your note cards, make sure you have the definitions down. And it's not enough to sort of generally know what a word means. I'll just say that. Like, we all have general senses of words. Those types of things won't exactly work on you. I mean, they're fine if that's all you got, but it's best to know the precise definition. And not like, oh yeah, we all know what that means. Like, no, you should probably know the precise definition. So the very first thing you should do if you read words and you know them is generate a complete, clear, precise definition off the top of your head. Say like, oh, that means to do blah, 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 right? And you want to do this before you look at your answer choices, before you look at a whole bunch of stuff, and we're going to go through this in a second why. But just make the definition, lay it out, and don't settle with some sort of like, oh yeah, of course I know what that means. No, say what it means. Because the more precisely you find the word, the better off you're going to be, right? Many words on the GRE have multiple definitions, so just be ready to switch between them. And if you know a word has two definitions, sometimes I like to start with both of them, like, oh, here's what it means as a noun and here's what it means as a verb. And we're going to talk a little bit, sometimes you can tell the difference between those just by the structure of the question, but just be ready. And if you have some definition and you go through and it doesn't work, you might be using the wrong definition, so just be aware of that. That oftentimes, and we'll see this a ton. Also, when memorizing using definitions, pay attention to all the components, right? And the reason for this is something like an antonym could be opposite, like let's say a word has two components, right? An antonym could be opposite of either of those components, right? So for example, the plummet, right? This is a good example. I think this comes up in the book somewhere. But plummet, if you want to look for the antonym of plummet, plummet means to decrease extremely rapidly, right? Well, it has two antonyms. One antonym would be skyrocket or increase or something like that. The other one, dwindle, would actually be an antonym too, because that's to decrease very, very slowly, right? So the point is you can hit different components that are opposite in different ways. So sort of try and be aware of that, that like, oh, there's two pieces to this definition. Also pay attention to the connotation, right? What the emotional coloring of it is. Okay, so that's when you know them. That's when you're in a good position. Approximate techniques, you are going to learn these really well as we go through them. But basically, they're just techniques for words whose definition you don't know, unfamiliar with, whatever. They vary in strength. Some of these are very, very good. Some of them are just, I mean, very blunt tools. That being said, like I said before, the GRE is a reasoning test. It's not a vocab test. So sometimes these are fully sufficient to get you where you need to be. So yeah, so first off, when you don't know something, like a word, just bring in any information where you've heard it in context, whatever, but there are some very sort of obvious things to do. First thing you should do is analyze prefixes and suffixes, because they'll tell you what part of speech it is. Like that numismatist example I showed you last time, the is tells you it's a person, something like that. You should also analyze roots. So one thing to keep in mind about roots is in English, due to the history of the language, most words that have 3 or more syllables are derived from Latin, Greek, and French, right? And these are like intellectual words. And these are where you're going to usually find the roots, right? You don't find them in short words. The reason is short words are Anglo-Saxon words. And so there's a couple pieces to that that's important. First off, don't look for roots generally in short words. You won't find them. Secondly, the longer words tend to be very intellectual, so they don't usually have connotations that are strong one way or another. They're sort of neutral, right? Whereas the short Anglo-Saxon words are, they tend to be more sort of emotionally laden, and oftentimes you can use the sound structure to get that out of it. So again, and break it at syllables. Roots tend to sit at syllables, right? They sort of naturally have their breaks. So hopefully you'll know the roots. If you don't know the roots, there's a couple other ways you can maybe get at them. Think of other common words that have the same pieces. And what you want to do, if you can, is sort of average across words, right? So let's say I see, some word circum that I don't remember what it is, and I think, oh, there's circumlocute, which means to talk around. There's circumnavigate, which means to go around. There's circumcise, which means to cut around, and I'm sort of thinking about all of these. what they all have in common is this around part. And that's what I mean by average. By averaging across a couple examples, if you can think of them, you're going to get what's common to them and eliminate whatever is not. And so that's one helpful way of doing it. Right, so I just talked about the other things. If you guys know a foreign language, especially a Romance language, Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, super helpful, because like I said, all the Romance languages are Latin-based or Latin-derived, and all of our big words are generally Latin-based or Latin-derived. So that can be really helpful. And in fact, I've definitely learned words because I'm like, oh, I know what that means in Spanish, but I don't know what it is in English. Think about where you might have heard the word. Obviously, you can tell we're starting to get into the sort of weaker techniques. Think of any context or whatever. Again, try and average across context so that hopefully you can pull out some central feature if you can. If you've heard it in multiple contexts, you can sort of pull out the key piece. And then the next one, gauge the temperature of the word. So here we're getting into even weaker techniques. Is it good connotation, bad connotation? A lot of problems you can actually get through with just like a little symbol like plus minus. Like, this is positive, this is negative, whatever else has to have that same relationship. You can do that. Okay, so this last one is kind of weird. So, yeah, this last one's a little bit weird. So, and I think people, well, I would be skeptical if someone told me this, but it's well established in the literature that some sort of features of the way that we think sometimes sort of leak into words, right? And the easiest way to demonstrate this is a classic, this is like a psycholinguistic study. So, which one's the sprackle and which one's the furball? You guys all know. Isn't that weird? This is clearly a sprackle and this is clearly a furball, right? The reason is because sprackle has these sharp sounds and we're crossing domains that are in line with these sharp points. And a furball sounds sort of rounded and like that. And this happens all over the place in language. There's a whole bunch of different ones that do this. So there's, oh no, I'm drawing a blank because I'm like trying to give this great example. There's words that like hang together. So there's something about a sn sound that has to do with the nose, for example. Sneeze, snout, schnoz, sniff, sniffle, right? Snot. There's like snuts, like all these nose words. There's another one, the gluz. The gluz are like sparkliness, like glisten, glitter, glamour. So there's all these features, and again, we don't really generally think about it or pick up on it, but you can use this to your advantage. I promise you, take a word and just go first instinct, even if it's just good, bad. You're like, I don't know what that is. It sounds like a round thing. I don't know. It sounds soft, right? Trust those intuitions, because what your brain is doing is extracting something out of sound structure, either from commonalities in the language, like the gluz or the snuz, or it's some sort of cognitive metaphor like this that you can extract out. A lot of times it works. No guarantees. This is not in any way a real rigorous method, but this is something that's true about language, and you can use it to your advantage. And if you have nothing else to go on, I've definitely done this before and totally my right answer is doing this, being like, oh, it sounds terrible, right? And you guys will see I'll sort of push you to do a lot of this stuff as we go through these. Does that make sense? That's sort of the one that I think is sort of unique. I don't know, I thought that was funny. Last thing is, you can use the structure and clues from the question to sort of gauge what's going on. This isn't exactly, so notice all the other ones are just sort of generally figuring out definitions. This is slightly different because it's just about using structures of questions. And more importantly, this is usually going to be combined, this last technique is usually going to be combined with one of the other ones. So you're going to use the structure of the question to help scaffold how you use the other ones. Again, we'll go through this. This is sort of abstract just to go through it, but I just want, again, get this all out there. And in doing the problems, this will make a lot more sense, I think. Last thing is consistency in parts of speech. When you look at, like, for example, in analogy questions, you're going to have two words there. And like I said, a lot of times these words have definitions, like one's a noun and one's a verb. And maybe the verb is more common, but they're going to be using the noun. You can actually know it's in the noun, because if you have, for example, adjective, noun, then all the answer choices are going to be of that structure too. Adjective, noun, adjective, noun, adjective, noun, adjective, noun. So they're always consistent. If you have an antonym that's a noun, but it's usually used as a verb, and then all your answers are nouns, you know that it has to be the noun part of speech. So that's something that can also help you. If you're like, what? And you should notice that too. If you like come up with a verb definition and then you notice they're all nouns, you should say, I know it's a noun. Even if you don't know the definition, that's very helpful because you might think like, well, how might this verb be related to a noun? Right? It can help you get to where you need to go. Rather than banging your head against the wall and being like, this doesn't make any sense, right? It's because you might be using the wrong definition. So just be aware that the answer choices, and it's not like there's always, analogies are always going to be, adjective, adjective. But if it's adjective noun, the same relation will hold between all of the answer choices. Cool, any questions?